10. Shots fired in the forest. College students Adam Simji and Michaela Paulus were driving through Alabama's Talladega National Forest one day in 2022 when a distressed woman flagged them down. She asked the couple if they could help her jumpstart her car, but they paid a devastating price for being good Samaritans. The woman, who was later identified as Yasmin Haider, forced them to march into the wilderness at gunpoint after they stopped to help. Simji then pulled out his own gun and shot at Haider. She survived, but he took a bullet in the crossfire and died. Haider called out to another woman, Crystal Pinkins, for help. Pinkins fled the scene not long after, giving Michaela the chance to call 911. She then tried to give CPR to her boyfriend, who was then pronounced dead at the scene. Detectives learned that Haider and Pinkins lived together at a camp in the forest with Pinkins' young son. It seemed as though the women abandoned their former lives to travel together a few months before the murder. Emergency responders took Haider to the hospital while deputies ordered Pinkins to get on the ground, at which point her son came out of the woods holding a loaded gun. Thankfully, deputies managed to take the gun from the child without any more people being hurt. Both women were charged with murder, kidnapping and robbery, and Pinkins faces an additional charge of child endangerment. In the meantime, investigators are unraveling the circumstances surrounding this bizarre crime and the suspect's activity in the days leading up to the shooting. A judge has issued a gag order, so the public won't know many details until the case finishes up in court. 9. Shaken down shop owner. In a weeks-long, terrifying scheme, a businessman from Staten Island, New York, was extorted by an armed crew of young men that made his life a living hell. It started in 2020 when the 60-year-old store owner met two brothers named Jassim and Jerome Jackson through a relative's friend. The Jacksons persuaded them to let them rent a vehicle in his name in exchange for $700 over the price. He agreed, but then he didn't see the men again for 2 years. When the brothers returned, they allegedly scammed the shop owner's debit and credit card machine and demanded thousands of dollars from him. He initially refused, but they threatened him with what he thought was a gun. Fearing for his life, he handed over the credit cards. Over the next few weeks, the Jacksons and several more suspects allegedly returned to the shop demanding more credit cards from the owner, threatening to harm his wife if he didn't comply. They also made the owner drive them to hotels and pay for their rooms, forced him to rent a car for them, and even take them to a clothing store in Manhattan. The victim's credit cards were declined at the store, and the Jacksons destroyed his car in a rage. They also threatened his and his family's lives. The thieves were eventually caught when they took a vehicle they rented in the victim's name to Florida and got pulled over. By then, the victim had no choice but to shutter his business thanks to financial losses. He said he regretted not going to the police sooner, but that he was afraid to contact authorities until the men were gone. And while the store owner is faced with the struggles of starting over, the masterminds of the crime are now in federal custody as they deal with their charges, which would likely come with prison time. 8. Botched bank burglary. One of the most prolific stories about a robbery gone wrong includes a man named Klaus Schmidt, who robbed a bank in Berlin, Germany at gunpoint back in 1995. Schmidt allegedly stormed into the building and ordered an employee to hand over the money. When the worker asked the burglar if he wanted the money in a bag or not, his only reply was, "Damn right, it's a real gun." Realizing that Schmidt was actually deaf, an employee set off a blaring alarm. He remained none the wiser to the fact that authorities were being told of his crime, and officers snuck right up behind him and caught him in the act red-handed. In a last-ditch effort to get payment in some form, Schmidt somehow managed to sue the bank for taking advantage of his disability during the robbery. 7. Gravedigger discovers a grave he didn't dig. In May 2022, a groundskeeper at a cemetery in Alabama noticed a freshly dug grave that he knew he didn't dig himself. In fact, a new grave hadn't been dug in the cemetery for over 100 years. He called law enforcement, who exhumed the recent burial and found the remains of 71-year-old Thomas Lee Creel, who was known for being independent. Which is why he was never reported missing, according to his devastated family members. They were left wanting answers and justice after learning of the suspicious death. After a months-long investigation, detectives charged 2 teenage boys with Creel's murder as well as robbery. Without going into too much graphic detail, law enforcement clarified that the victim and suspects knew each other. Creel's relatives told local news station WBRC that the suspects had a history of issues with the old man, and that it had something to do with them trespassing onto his property multiple times. The teens are accused of victimizing Creel in his own home, burying him in the grave, and then taking what they wanted out of his belongings. But they weren't as slick as they thought, and now they have no choice but to answer to the justice system for the allegations made against them. 6. A convenient call ahead. When Albert Bailey decided to rob a Connecticut bank in 2010, he apparently wanted to get the job done as quickly as possible. So he called the People's Bank in Fairfield ahead of time and told the employee on the other end to have $100,000 in large bills ready. He threatened to make a bloodbath at the institution if they failed to meet his demands. But instead of doing what they were told, the worker dialed 911. In the meantime, staff members locked the bank down. By then, Bailey's accomplice was already at the scene. He handed the teller a note while the employee who called 911 spoke with a police dispatcher. The teller handed the suspect about $900 in cash, and he then asked to be let out of the bank. But it was too late for him to escape. Patrol cars were already surrounding the bank. As the thief left the building, he encountered a police officer who ordered him to stop. He tried to quickly run toward his getaway car where Bailey was waiting. Both men were apprehended at the scene. Detective Lieutenant Michael Gagner told CNN that he'd heard of thieves robbing banks through drive-up windows, but this was the first time he ever heard of a suspect calling to schedule their robbery ahead of time. The situation marked Bailey's second bank robbery in only a 7-year period. He pleaded guilty to avoid a trial and received a 9-year prison sentence. Because the other suspect was a minor, details of his case were never revealed to the public. Who would have thought? Looks like bank robbers don't have common sense. 5. Murderous gang members. Determined to move up within the ranks of the Troup County, Georgia Bloods gang, Travis McFarland got into a vehicle one night in 2019 and shot the driver James Jake Ponder. Better known by his nickname Slime Hext, he and his accomplice Omar Atchison allegedly planned only to rob their victim. But something went wrong and Ponder took a bullet instead. The victim's friend drove him to the hospital where he was later pronounced dead. Investigators initially believed Ponder was giving the suspects a ride, but they eventually learned he'd arranged to buy a gun and was about to do so when he got shot. He was completely unaware that he was the target of an attempted armed robbery. McFarland was apprehended within days of the incident, and Atchison turned himself in about a month after the murder. McFarland was found guilty and received a life sentence, while the outcome of Atchison's case remains unknown. 4. Bishopsgate stabbing. When civilians noticed 2 thieves on bikes attacking a man in London one morning in October 2022, they tried to stop the thugs from stealing the victim's phone. The robber then stabbed 3 Good Samaritans. 2 of them were delivery drivers who stopped to intervene in the theft. 3 victims were rushed to the hospital with stab wounds. Luckily, they all survived. A construction worker told local news outlet My London that the perpetrators looked like teenagers and that they targeted a middle-aged man. He also said the victim put up a good fight when the thieves tried taking his phone. The suspects fled the scene on their bikes and initially escaped law enforcement, but police caught up to them within days of the crime. 2 men were arrested for allegedly committing the robbery and face additional charges, including conspiracy to commit robbery, causing grievous bodily harm, and possession of a weapon. A woman was also charged with assisting one of the offenders. 3. A hilarious handoff. In 2012, a thief entered a Halifax bank branch in London and demanded to be given £700,000 in cash. His plan to walk away richer went hilariously wrong when he accidentally handed the teller his gun instead of the bag he was going to use for the money. Not knowing what to make of the strange situation, the teller froze. By the time the robber realized his mistake though, the employee was holding the weapon in his hand. The thief tried to grab the gun back, but ran off empty-handed as staff members hit the alarm button. He managed to escape on a stolen bike before the security shutters came down. A police source told the Daily Telegraph that this thief was not the sharpest tool in the box. Based on the mix-up between his gun and money bag, authorities assumed he was inexperienced and panicked during the robbery. But he was slick enough to escape and remain well hidden. Police had to release surveillance footage to the public and offer a £25,000 reward in exchange for information on the suspect. It's unclear if he was ever caught. 2. A dazed intruder. In 2007, a home intruder named Mark Smith decided to rob a house in northern England while high on Valium and drunk off vodka. The 24-year-old slipped past the homeowner, 57-year-old Heather Stevenson, while she was doing some chores and helped himself to her checkbook and jewelry. But he apparently got sleepy from the drugs he'd taken earlier that day and dozed off under Miss Stevenson's bed with a pair of earrings in his hand. She came into her room and was shocked to find Smith asleep with his legs sticking out from under the bed frame. Stevenson later told the Northern Echo that she shook the man's leg and shouted at him, but he didn't wake up, so she ended up calling the police. Smith was still asleep when they arrived. Officers also failed to get a response out of him. When they dragged him out from under the bed, he was still clutching the earrings he'd snatched from Stevenson's jewelry box. Beneath him, the police also found the woman's stolen checkbook. Smith's attorney, Robert Adams, described his client as someone who had a hopeless addiction to alcohol and drugs. Adams claimed that when Smith was sober, he was clearly remorseful for his actions. He pleaded guilty to the crime and received an 18th-month jail sentence, along with a place on many dumbest criminals lists. In all fairness, the court acknowledged the young man's efforts to get clean and to finally get his life on the right track. Stevenson was forgiving towards Smith and said that she even felt sorry for him after finding him under her bed and thinking he was probably a drunk who just happened to walk through her front door. She had no animosity toward the burglar, even though she admittedly was unable to sleep in her room for weeks after the robbery. 1. Under the cover of daylight. 3 months after James Blankenship's mother banned him from her Ohio home in 2013, he decided he was going to return whether she liked it or not. He removed a window screen and illegally entered the property, but it didn't take long for his mother to realize his presence and call 911. Instead of leaving the scene like most thieves would, the suspect hid in the crawl space. And while he clearly knew he was unwelcome at the home, he seemed a bit surprised when confronted by police officers. Blankenship told the cops he didn't think they were allowed to arrest people for burglary during the day. The news never reported on what gave him that idea or whether he genuinely believed what he was saying or just acting stupid in an attempt to avoid charges. But it wasn't Blankenship's first time committing a robbery. In fact, just 1 week earlier, he'd received a suspended jail sentence and fine for a previous breaking and entering charge. So it's probably safe to say that he knew, at least on some level, that what he was doing was very wrong. Thanks for watching. Would you rather have to defend a stranger in a robbery or find an intruder relaxing in your bathtub? Let us know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.